The door of the Davies ranch closed with the sound of finality, a heavy oak punctuation mark at the end of Alara's life as she had known it. On the other side stood her husband's family. Inside was the warmth of a fire she was no longer welcome to share, the smell of baking bread she would no longer eat. Outside, there was only the sharp November wind and the hard-packed dirt of the yard. Her father-in-law, Mr. Davies, had not even met her gaze as he'd pressed the folded paper and 3 silver dollars into her hand. His words were as cold and worn as river stones. "Thomas is gone. The ranch has mouths enough to feed. This is yours now. His folly." She looked down at her inheritance. The deed was for a worthless patch of rock and scree 5 miles up into the foothills, a place the locals called the Devil's Chimney. Thomas had bought it in a fit of optimistic madness, dreaming of a small cabin of their own, away from the overbearing shadow of his father. The $3 were a pittance, an insult dressed as charity. It was everything she had left in the world, aside from the worn wool dress on her back, the sturdy boots on her feet, and the shaggy, silent dog at her side. Boulder, who had been Thomas's shadow, was now hers. The community of Providence watched her departure with a mixture of pity and grim satisfaction. They saw a woman cast out, a widow with no prospects, clinging to a worthless piece of paper. Mr. Gable, the owner of the mercantile, leaned on his counter as she came in, his expression one of condescending sympathy. "Go east, girl," he advised, his voice a low rumble. "Find work in a city. No one can make a living on that rock pile. Davies is a hard man, but he's not wrong about that land." He offered her a place in the back room, mending flour sacks for pennies a day. It was charity, and it felt like a cage. Alara looked at his soft hands, then down at her own, which were already calloused from the work of a ranch wife. She thought of the whispers that had followed her since Thomas's funeral, the sideways glances from the women in their Sunday best. They saw her as a burden, a problem to be solved or shunted aside. A quiet fire, one she didn't know she possessed, began to burn in her chest. It was not a fire of rage, but of cold, hard resolve. She pushed one of her silver dollars across the counter. "I'll need a good axe," she said, her voice steady, "and a sack of salt, the biggest you have." Mr. Gable stared, then let out a short, incredulous laugh. But he took the coin. She spent the rest on flour, beans, and a small iron pot. She turned her back on the town, on its pity and its judgment, and with Boulder trotting faithfully beside her, she began to walk toward the hills. The weight of the axe was unfamiliar in her hands, but it felt like the beginning of an answer. The journey to the Devil's Chimney was a punishing pilgrimage. The wagon road quickly dwindled to a hunter's trail, then to nothing at all. The land grew hostile, clawing at her with thorny brush and forcing her to scramble over fields of broken stone. Each step was a battle against the rising elevation and the weight of her meager supplies. The sack of salt felt like an anchor, the iron pot a leaden bell. The wind had a raw edge to it, a promise of the winter to come, and it sliced through her thin dress like a knife. Boulder stayed close, his body a warm, reassuring presence in the vast, indifferent wilderness. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of her boots on gravel and the sigh of the wind through skeletal pines. When she finally arrived, despair hit her like a physical blow. The deed had not lied, nor had the town's mockery. It was a place of profound desolation. A sheer cliff face of gray, weathered limestone rose from a steep slope of scree. At its base was the feature that gave the place its name, a dark, vertical fissure, no wider than a man's shoulders, that split the rock from bottom to top. It looked like a wound in the earth, a place where nothing could or would ever grow. The wind howled around the rock face, seeming to gather itself before plunging into the surrounding canyons. This wasn't land, it was a geological scar. For a long, heart-stopping moment, Ilara believed them all. Mr. Davies, Mr. Gable, the whole town of Providence. They were right. This was a fool's errand. This was a place to die. She sank to her knees, the iron pot clattering against the stones, and the cold dread she had been holding at bay washed over her. Her eyes stung with tears she refused to let fall. Boulder nudged her hand with his wet nose, whining softly. She absently stroked his thick fur, her gaze fixed on the black maw of the fissure. And then she felt it. Or rather, she felt the absence of it. The biting wind that had tormented her for the entire journey was not blowing out of the crack in the rock. In fact, there was no draft at all. She stood, her curiosity overriding her despair, and cautiously approached. As she got closer, she could feel a distinct difference in the air. It was still, and it was not frozen. It was cool, yes, but a deep, cellar cool, not the biting, aggressive cold of the outside world. She held her hand up to the opening. A faint, almost imperceptible current of air moved upward, drawn from the depths of the fissure toward the sky. It was a natural chimney. She ran her palm along the rock face beside the opening. It was dry, shielded from the elements. She peered inside. The darkness was intimidating, but the air smelled clean, of damp earth and stone, not of rot or animal lairs. Deeper within, she heard a sound, a slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip. Water. A steady, protected source of water. The despair in her chest did not vanish, but it made room for something else, a grim, tenacious spark of an idea. The town saw a worthless hole, a tomb. Ilara began to see a foundation. She saw shelter from the wind, a source of water, and a chimney already built by the hand of God. The town was wrong. The work began at dawn the next day. It was a brutal education in the physics of labor. Her first task was to fell the sparse, hardy pines that clung to the less severe slopes nearby. Thomas's axe was sharp, but her arms were not accustomed to the violent, repetitive shock of steel biting into wood. The muscles in her back and shoulders screamed in protest. Blisters rose on her palms, broke and bled, leaving her hands raw and tender. She learned to wrap them in strips of cloth torn from her petticoat. She learned the precise angle of the cut, the rhythm of the swing, the way a tree would groan just before it gave way. Dragging the logs back to the cliff face was a different kind of agony. She would tie a rope around one end and pull, her boots slipping on the loose scree, her legs burning with the effort. Boulder, seeming to understand the desperation of their task, would often grab the rope in his teeth and pull alongside her, his low growls a testament to his own strain. Together, the woman and the dog, they moved the forest one tree at a time. It was slow, torturous progress, measured in inches and celebrated with exhausted collapses in the dirt. Her shelter took shape not by design, but by necessity. She built against the cliff face, using the solid rock as the back wall of her home. The logs were stacked to form two side walls, extending out from the entrance to the fissure. It was crude work. She had no nails, no pegs. She learned to notch the logs with her axe, fitting them together in a clumsy but effective saddle notch joint. The gaps between them were enormous, gaping mouths that invited the wind. But it was a start. It was a shape. The next phase was stone. The slope was littered with limestone, sharp-edged and heavy. She hauled them one by one, her body aching with a deep, resonant pain she had never imagined. She used the larger, flatter stones to build a foundation for her log walls, giving them stability. Then she began the painstaking process of filling the gaps between the logs. It was a puzzle of 1,000 pieces, each one a dead weight that had to be lifted and fitted into place. She discovered a deposit of clay near the water seep inside the fissure. It was a revelation. Mixing the clay with water and sand, she created a crude but effective mortar. She plastered it between the stones and logs, chinking every last crack against the wind. Her hands were constantly caked in the cold, wet mixture. The work was relentless, a cycle of hauling, lifting, and plastering that consumed her days and left her too exhausted to dream at night. She was no longer a widow or an outcast. She was a creature of pure physical effort. Inside this rough-hewn shell, she began to build the systems that would keep her alive. The fissure itself became the heart of her home. The front part, just inside her structure, was the pantry and water source. She spent days with a smaller rock, painstakingly chipping away at the stone floor around the slow drip, carving a shallow basin. She lined it with the best clay, packing it down until it was watertight. It took a full day for the cistern to fill, but it was a gallon of clear, cold water that was hers, safe from the elements. Her most crucial system was heat. She built a massive hearth and fireplace against the cliff face, right next to the entrance to the fissure. The stone she used was dense and heavy, chosen for its ability to hold heat. She constructed it with a kind of desperate reverence, knowing her life depended on it. The back of the fireplace was the cliff itself, and she angled the flue to vent directly into the natural updraft of the fissure. The rock wall became a thermal mass. When she finally lit the first fire, the smoke did not billow into her small room. It was drawn cleanly upward, disappearing into the dark crack in the mountain. The stone wall began to warm, a slow, deep heat that radiated into the small space. That night, for the first time, she slept in profound warmth, the fire crackling beside her, boulder curled at her feet. The wind howled outside, but inside her stone and log cocoon, it was only a distant whisper. She was still there. It worked. The final system was the one born of the fissure's unique gift. The constant, gentle updraft was perfect for drying and curing. She had a sack of salt and a steady supply of rabbits and grouse from the snares she set. She began to experiment, hanging strips of meat deep within the fissure where the air was cool, dry, and constantly moving. The results were remarkable. The meat cured perfectly, preserved against spoilage. She realized then that this was more than just a home. The Devil's Chimney was a tool. It was a smokehouse, a larder, a fortress. It was a source of income, a path to an independence she had never dared to imagine. After 2 months of relentless labor, her supplies ran low. She needed more than just salt now. She needed the things that would turn this shelter into a sustainable homestead. She needed chickens for eggs. She needed more flour, more beans, perhaps a piglet she could raise. With a deep breath, she packed a small bundle, took up the axe as much for protection as for work, and started the long walk back to Providence. Her return to the town caused a stir. The people who saw her barely recognized the grieving widow who had left. Her face was weathered by sun and wind. Her dress was stained and patched, and her hands were the rough, calloused hands of a quarryman. Her eyes, however, held a new light, not of happiness, but of a fierce, unyielding competence. She walked with a purpose that silenced the usual street corner chatter. At the Mercantile, Mr. Gable's jaw dropped. "Good Lord, Ilara, you're alive." His surprise was genuine, tinged with an admiration he tried to hide. We thought the mountain had taken you." "The mountain gives, Mr. Gable," she replied, her voice raspy from disuse. "I need 2 laying hens, a piglet if you can find one, and another sack of salt." The request was so audacious, so contrary to the narrative of the poor, doomed widow, that a small crowd gathered. "A piglet? Up at the Devil's Chimney?" The whispers started, louder this time. The pity was gone, replaced by a kind of fascinated mockery. This wasn't just foolishness anymore, it was madness. Brant, a young trapper known for his loud mouth, guffawed. "Gonna raise hogs on a rock slide, Ilara? What'll you feed 'em? Pebbles?" The laughter stung, but Ilara did not flinch. She counted out the money she had earned from selling 2 perfectly cured rabbit pelts to a traveling fur trader she'd met on the trail. She bought her supplies, secured the chickens in a wicker cage, and fashioned a leash for the squealing piglet. The journey back was even harder than the first. She had to carry the cage, drag the pig, and manage her sack of supplies. The townspeople watched her go, shaking their heads. They gave her a new name that day. No longer just the Folly Girl, she was now the Chimney Witch, a wild woman living in a crack in the earth, trying to conjure a farm out of thin air. Boulder was her shadow, her guard, her only confidant. As she worked, he would lie nearby, watching her with intelligent eyes, a silent partner in her monumental task. At night, when the bone-deep exhaustion settled in, and the profound loneliness of her existence threatened to overwhelm her, his warm, heavy body pressed against hers was a comfort beyond words. He was the living, breathing proof that she was not entirely alone. When she spoke, it was often to him, her thoughts and plans voiced aloud to a listener who never judged, who only offered a soft whine or a thump of his tail in response. He was the keeper of her sanity in the vast, silent wilderness. The mockery from the town solidified into a local legend. Children would dare each other to get close to the Devil's Chimney, hoping for a glimpse of the witch. Hunters who passed nearby would report seeing a thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke rising from the cliff face, smelling faintly of hickory. It only added to the myth. Her isolation was complete. One day, a visitor arrived. It was Mr. Davies. He rode up on his fine horse, his face a mask of stern disapproval. He surveyed her small, sturdy home, the stone-walled pen she had built for the now thriving pig, the coop where her chickens scratched contentedly. He saw the neat stacks of firewood, the clear order of her homestead. He had expected to find a ruin or a grave. He found a fortress. "This is madness, Ilara," he said, his voice tight. "Winter is coming. A real winter. This thing you've built will be your tomb. Come back to Providence. I'll speak to Gable. You can work in the mercantile. Don't let pride be the death of you." Ilara looked at him, at the man who had cast her out with $3 and a worthless deed. She felt no anger, only a great distance. They lived in different worlds. His was a world of fences and ownership, of social standing and spoken rules. Hers was a world of stone and wind, of thermal mass and the physics of survival. "I am home, Mr. Davies," she said quietly. And that was all. He stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head, turned his horse, and rode away, defeated by a resolve he could not comprehend. As autumn deepened, she settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of her small domain. Each day began before dawn, stoking the fire, ensuring the great stone wall was saturated with heat. She would check the water cistern, clear the channel of any debris. She fed the chickens and the pig, their sounds a small, reassuring chorus of life in the silence. She checked her snare lines, resetting them with practiced efficiency. The bounty of the mountain was lean but steady. Her smokehouse was her true triumph. The fisher, her larder, was now hung with curing hams from her pig, along with dozens of smoked rabbits and grouse. The air within was thick with the rich, savory scent of preservation. This was not just food for the winter. This was wealth. This was security, earned with her own 2 hands. Her world was small, but it was whole. It was a closed system of warmth, water, and food, all powered by her labor, and the hidden gifts of the mountain. Winter sent its heralds first, a series of small storms, each one a test of her creation. One night, a pack of wolves, drawn by the scent of the smokehouse, circled her home. Their howls echoed off the cliff face, a terrifying symphony of hunger. But her walls were stone and thick-notched log. Her door was solid oak, barred from the inside. Boulders stood before it, hackles raised, his deep, menacing bark a clear answer to their calls. The wolves could find no purchase, no weakness. Eventually, they moved on, leaving her in a silence that felt like a victory. Another time, a week of freezing rain coated everything in a thick shell of ice. But inside, her fire burned. The thermal mass radiated its gentle heat, and the water in her cistern, protected by the earth itself, did not freeze. Each small test was a confirmation. She was ready. Then, in the heart of January, the great blizzard of '83 arrived. It did not come like a normal storm. It fell from the sky like a hammer, a sudden, violent assault of wind and snow that blotted out the sun in minutes. The temperature plummeted with breathtaking speed, going from merely cold to lethally frigid. The wind was not a moan, but a scream, a solid wall of force that tore at the very fabric of the world. It was a storm that broke all the rules, a monster of ice and fury beyond living memory. In Providence, the world broke. The conventional wisdom of frontier building proved to be a fatal vanity. Roofs, built to shed snow, were caught by the hurricane-force winds and peeled away like birch bark. The fine log homes of the town's leading citizens shuddered and groaned, the chinking between the logs blasted out by the sheer pressure of the wind, letting in jets of snow and ice-cold air. Chimneys, the very hearts of their homes, became their enemies. The wind forced the smoke back down, filling rooms with choking fumes, while ice clogged the flues. The town's preparations were a mockery. Firewood, neatly stacked in woodsheds, was buried under 10-foot drifts, unreachable. The central meeting hall, designated as the town's emergency shelter, was the first to fail. A great crack spidered across its north-facing wall as the foundation shifted in the frozen ground. Panic set in. Families huddled together in the single warm room left in their house, burning furniture to stay alive. Livestock, the town's lifeblood, froze to death in their barns, their lowing turning to silence. The confidence of Providence, its belief in its own sturdiness, shattered like thin ice. The town was dying. But 5 miles up in the foothills, in the heart of the Devil's Chimney, it was another world. Elara's home did not fight the storm. It yielded to it. Her low-slung roof, banked with earth and snow, presented no edge for the wind to catch. The wind screamed over the top of the cliff face, a tempest happening in another reality, high above her head. Her stone and log walls, anchored to the mountain itself, did not tremble. They were as impassive as the cliff they were part of. Inside, a profound and steady peace reigned. The great stone hearth radiated a deep, penetrating warmth that filled the small space. The fire drew perfectly, its smoke whisked away by the relentless, invisible pull of the fissure. Her chickens clucked softly in their coop, nestled against the warm stone. The pig snored in its pen. The water in her cistern was cool and clear. She was not fighting the storm. She was outside its reach, living in a bubble of warmth and order, while the world outside descended into chaos and death. She had built more than a shelter. She had built a sanctuary. On the third day of the blizzard, a sound broke the rhythm of the storm's howl. It was a frantic, desperate banging on her door. Boulder erupted in a frenzy of barking, not of aggression but of alarm. Elara's heart hammered in her chest. No one could be out in this. It was impossible. She unbarred the heavy door, and a figure, more snow than man, collapsed into her home. She dragged the body inside, slamming the door against the raging storm. As she brushed the ice from his face, she recognized him. It was Brant, the young trapper, the one who had laughed the loudest at her in the mercantile. His face was a mask of frostbite, his lips blue, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. He was half dead. For a single, cold moment, she saw not a dying man, but the embodiment of the town's mockery. She remembered his jeering words, "Gonna raise hogs on a rock slide?" The bitterness was a sour taste in her mouth. Helping him would cost her. It would mean using more of her carefully rationed firewood, her precious stored food, her hard-won peace. It was a choice. Let the consequences of his arrogance play out, or honor a duty to a fellow human being, however undeserving. The memory of his laughter faded, replaced by the sight of his shivering, helpless form. The choice was not a choice at all. It was who she was. She stripped off his frozen outer layers and wrapped him in the warmest blankets she had, placing him as close to the hearth as was safe. She ladled hot broth from the pot simmering over the fire and forced it between his lips. Slowly, life began to return to him. His shivering subsided, and words began to form. He told her of the horrors in Providence, of the collapsing roofs, the freezing families. He spoke of Mr. Davies, his ranch house failing, his family huddled in the kitchen. And he told her the one thing he knew would break through her isolation. Mr. Davies' young grandson, her nephew by marriage, was sick with a lung fever, and the cold was killing him. A new resolve settled over Ilara. This was no longer just about survival. She looked at her stores, at the hams and smoked meats hanging in the fissure, at the formidable stack of dry firewood. She had a surplus. She had built not just for herself, but for a crisis she hadn't known was coming. She packed a small hand sled she had built for hauling wood. She loaded it with thick cuts of smoked pork, a small bundle of the driest, hottest-burning hickory, and her warmest fur blankets. She turned to Brant. "Stay," she commanded. "Tend the fire. Don't let it go out." Then, with Boulder at her side, she opened the door and stepped out into the white hell of the storm. The journey to Providence was a battle for every footstep, a brutal war against a wind that sought to flay her alive. When they finally reached the Davies Ranch, it was a scene of utter devastation. One of the barn roofs had caved in, and the main house looked like a besieged outpost. Snow drifted halfway up its walls. She didn't knock. She put her shoulder to the door and forced it open against the snow that had piled against it. The sight that greeted her stunned the family into silence. They were huddled in the kitchen, the only room they could keep remotely warm, burning splintered chairs in the cook stove. They were gaunt, their faces smudged with soot and etched with fear. When they saw Ilara, framed in the doorway, covered in snow but radiating a vital, indomitable strength, their jaws dropped. They looked at her as if she were an apparition. This was not the broken widow they had sent away. This was a force of nature. Mr. Davies, his face gray with exhaustion and failure, stared at her, speechless. Their shock was absolute when they entered her home. After the storm broke, a small party from the town, led by Mr. Davies himself, made the journey to her homestead. They came to offer thanks, but also out of a desperate curiosity. As they stepped from the cold, bright world of snow into the warmth of her shelter, they stopped dead. The air was warm, not with the scorching, dry heat of an overstoked stove, but with a deep, radiant warmth that seemed to come from the stone itself. They saw the neat rows of smoked meat hanging in the fissure, a larder that could feed a family for a year. They saw the clear water in the cistern, the healthy chickens in their coop. They saw not a hovel, but a miracle of engineering. Brant, now recovered, simply pointed to the back wall. "The whole mountain is her stove," he said, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on worship. They stared at the fissure, at the smoke from the fire being drawn cleanly away into the earth. They could not reconcile the chimney witch of their gossip with the quiet, ingenious woman who stood before them. The reality of what she had accomplished was so far beyond their imagination that it left them humbled and silent. Mr. Davies was the last to speak. He walked through her small home, his calloused rancher's hand running over the smooth, solid wall of mortared stone. He looked at Alara, his eyes finally meeting hers without pride or pity. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a profound, soul-shaking humility. "We were wrong," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "We called you a fool. My God, Alara, we were the fools." He looked at his son's widow, the woman he had discarded, who had then saved his grandson's life. "We left you to die, and you lived better than any of us." Alara felt the last vestiges of her bitterness wash away. Vengeance was a shallow, empty thing. The vindication she felt was not in his admission, but in the steady warmth at her back, in the weight of the axe in her hand, in the quiet snores of the pig in its pen. She had not built this place to prove them wrong. She had built it to live. Her response to his broken apology was a simple, practical act of grace. She gestured to the smoked hams. "There is food," she said. "Take what you need for your families. The winter is not over yet." In the weeks that followed the great blizzard, everything changed. Alara's story became the defining legend of Providence. The derisive nickname was never spoken again. People now referred to her home with respect. The Hill House, or simply Alara's place. They came not to gawk, but to learn. Men who had built cabins their whole lives came to study her use of thermal mass, the way she had integrated her home into the landscape instead of just sitting it on top. They saw how she had turned a natural flaw in the rock into her greatest asset. Mr. Davies made a public apology in front of the whole town and tried to give her half the ranch. She refused. Instead, she asked only for a new, formal deed to her land, one that described it not as a worthless rock pile, but as the Hill House homestead, her title clear and undeniable for all time. She began to trade in earnest. Her smoked meats, cured to perfection in the fisher's constant draft, became the most sought-after commodity in the region. She traded for a milk cow, for more pigs, for seed. Her small, solitary shelter grew into a thriving, self-sufficient homestead. The impact on the wider community was profound. When people began to rebuild, they did so with new principles. They built lower to the ground, with thick stone walls facing the prevailing winds. They looked for natural advantages in the land, overhangs, southern exposures, windbreaks. Alara's home was no longer an oddity. It was the blueprint for survival in a harsh and unforgiving land. Travelers and trappers carried her story to other settlements, and the tale of the widow who built her house into a mountain became a quiet legend of the frontier. Years later, Alara would stand at her doorway, watching the evening sun set fire to the western peaks. Her home was no longer a solitary structure, but the heart of a small, thriving farmstead carved from the rock. Boulder, now gray around the muzzle, rested his head on her knee. She had not simply endured the injustice done to her. She had used it as a foundation. She had taken what everyone in the world had deemed worthless, a cast-off woman and a barren piece of land, and from it she had built not just a shelter, but a life of substance and dignity. Her legacy was written not in a history book, but in the stones of her wall, in the scent of hickory smoke on the wind, and in the quiet, unshakable strength she had found in the heart of the mountain.